The stars had watched over Earth for billions of years, silent and distant. Until the day they were not silent anymore, Ambassador. Thelvan had lived for 3,000 years and had seen many things that would break the minds of lesser beings. But nothing had prepared the crystalline diplomat for the strange blue world called Earth. The Valith Collective had sent Thelvan because the ambassador was patient, wise, and had delivered the same terrible message to 11 civilizations before this one. And every single time the response had been the same: terror, despair, and eventually acceptance of doom. The great ship descended through Earth's atmosphere on a Tuesday morning in the year 2031, and within hours every television screen, every phone, every computer displayed the same image of the massive vessel hovering above the United Nations headquarters in New York City. Thelvan stepped out onto the platform that extended from the Fiu ship and looked down at the gathered crowds of humans. Their small faces turned upward with expressions the ambassador had seen many times before: fear, wonder, confusion. People of Earth, Thelvan began, the crystalline body catching the sunlight and throwing rainbow patterns across the gathered diplomats. I come with news that will change everything you know about your place in the universe. The humans listened, and Thelvan felt a small spark of hope that perhaps this species would be different, that perhaps they would take the warning seriously and make the choice that could save at least some of them. 300 years from now, a force known as the Devour Swarm will reach your solar system. Thelvan continued, the translator implant converting the crystalline being's harmonic speech into words the humans could understand. This swarm has consumed 11 civilizations, billions upon billions of souls, and nothing in the known galaxy has ever stopped them. The crowd murmured, and Thelvan saw the Secretary General of the United Nations lean forward in her seat. Her face pale. The Valith Collective offers you a choice, the ambassador said, spreading arms that looked like frozen lightning. We can evacuate your most promising individuals to protected worlds far from the swarm's path, where your species might survive in some form. Or you can remain here and face extinction. Thelvan waited for the screaming to begin, for the panic, for the desperate begging that had come from every other species that had heard this news. Instead, a human in the back of the crowd shouted something that the translator struggled to interpret. Did that guy just ask if you come in peace? Another human yelled, and suddenly there was laughter. Thelvan's crystalline form flickered with confusion as the ambassador watched the humans begin talking among themselves, some of them actually smiling. The Secretary General stood and approached the microphone, and Thelvan leaned forward to hear the official response of humanity to the news of their impending doom. Ambassador Thelvan, the Secretary General said, and her voice was steady, almost casual. On behalf of the people of Earth, I want to thank you for the heads up, and we will certainly take your warning under advisement. That was it. That was the entire response. And Thelvan stood there in complete bewilderment as the crowd began to disperse, many of them already looking at their phones. The ambassador returned to the ship that evening and sent a report back to the Valith High Council that began with a sentence no Valith had ever written before. I do not understand what happened today. Within 72 hours, Thelvan discovered what humans did when faced with existential terror. They made jokes. Someone had taken the footage of the ambassador's speech and set it to music, a bouncing electronic track that made Thelvan's warning sound like a party invitation. And this video had been viewed over 100 million times. A human website called Reddit had created something called a subreddit dedicated entirely to making humorous images of Thelvan in various absurd situations. The ambassador riding a small Earth vehicle called a bicycle. The ambassador wearing a hat designed for celebrations. The ambassador holding a small Earth feline. A major corporation that sold food had released something called the Devour Meal, which came with a toy shaped like Thelvan's crystalline form. The ambassador watched all of this from the ship. And for the first time in 3,000 years, Thelvan did not know what to do. "They are not taking this seriously," the ambassador reported to the High Council. "I have shown them footage of the swarm consuming worlds, of entire species reduced to nothing. And they have responded by creating what they call memes." The High Council was equally confused. But they had seen stranger things in their long history of observing the galaxy. And they advised Thelvan to be patient. "Perhaps this is simply how they process grief," one council member suggested. "Perhaps the jokes will stop and the fear will come." But the jokes did not stop 1 year after the warning. Humanity had created an entire genre of comedy films about incompetent alien invasions. And Thelvan appeared as a background character in at least 3 of them. 5 years after the warning, someone launched a form of digital currency called Swarmcoin, and it briefly became worth more than some national currencies before, collapsing in what humans called the funniest financial disaster since that time with the apes. 10 years after the warning, Thelvan returned to Earth to check on humanity's progress toward evacuation and found that they had made no progress at all. Or at least no progress that the ambassador could detect. The humans were still fighting among themselves about politics and borders, and whether certain foods belonged on other foods. And they seemed to have completely forgotten that they were all going to die. Thelvan stood before the United Nations again, this time with a heavy heart, and delivered the warning once more. "The swarm is now 290 years away," the ambassador said. "Have you begun preparations for evacuation?" The human representative smiled in a way that Thelvan had learned to recognize as polite but not serious, and said, "We appreciate your concern, Ambassador, but we have decided to stay and see what happens." "You have decided to die," Thelvan said, the crystalline form darkening with something that might have been sadness. "We have decided to live," the human replied, "for as long as we can, in whatever way we choose. And if the end comes, well, at least we will have had fun." The ambassador left Earth that day convinced that humanity was doomed. Not because they could not be saved, but because they refused to be saved. What Thelvan did not know, what Novalith would discover for another century and a half, was that humanity had heard the warning perfectly clearly. They had simply decided that fear was not the only possible response, and somewhere beneath the Mojave Desert, in a facility that did not appear on any map, a team of engineers watched the ambassador's ship depart, and then return to their work on something they had codenamed Project Mockingbird. The first antimatter containment unit exploded that night, killing 3 researchers and destroying 2 years of work. The next morning, the surviving team members started building another one. That was the thing about humans that the Valith would never quite understand. They laughed at death, not because they did not fear it, but because they refused to let fear be the thing that defined them. The jokes were not a sign of ignorance. The jokes were a declaration of war. The Valith Collective checked on Earth every 10 years. And every 10 years they left more confused than before. Ambassador Thelvan had retired after the first century, passing the duty to a younger crystalline being named Crystalline Who Mourns, a name chosen specifically because the new ambassador expected to witness the death of yet another species. Crystalline Who Mourns arrived at Earth in the year 2091 and found humanity doing exactly what they had been doing 60 years earlier, arguing about things that did not matter, fighting wars over imaginary lines on maps, and producing an endless stream of entertainment about fictional versions of the very real threat that was coming to kill them all. They have made another film, Crystalline Who Mourns reported to the High Council. This one is called Swarm Busters, and it depicts humans defeating the Devourer. swarm using weapons that do not exist and could not possibly work. And they are showing this film to their children as though it were a comedy. The council sighed collectively. A sound like wind chimes in a storm. Have they made any actual preparations? Asked the eldest council member. None that I can detect, Crystalline Who Mourns replied. Their space program remains primitive. Their weapons technology is barely capable of reaching their own moon. And they continue to spend most of their resources on things that have nothing to do with survival. What the ambassador did not know, what no Valith scanner could detect, was that humanity had become very good at hiding things. The year was 2091, and beneath the surface of the Earth, the real work had been happening for decades. DARPA, the American Military Research Agency, had tripled its budget in the years after Thelvan's warning, but the money did not appear in any public document, and the projects it funded did not have names that anyone outside a very small circle would recognize. The European Space Agency had merged with 6 other national programs under a classified directive that even most European leaders did not know about. And they had built things in orbit that looked like communication satellites, but were not. Communication satellites at all China and the United States, still publicly threatening each other with trade wars and diplomatic incidents, had quietly established something called the Joint Orbital Defense Initiative. And their scientists worked side by side in facilities that officially did not exist. Every major nation contributed to Project Mockingbird, named after humanity's favorite survival strategy, making noise to distract predators. While the real work happened somewhere else, the public knew nothing. And that was by design. If we tell them the truth, the Secretary General of the United Nations said in a meeting that was never recorded, they will panic, and panic does not build weapons. Panic does not train soldiers. Panic does not solve problems. But we are telling them the truth. Another leader pointed out. The aliens told everyone. Yes, the Secretary General replied with a smile that did not reach her eyes. And they turned it into a joke, which means they are processing the fear in their own way. And meanwhile, we can work without interference. The humans had learned something important in their long history of surviving things that should have killed them the best way to hide. A secret was to put it in plain sight and make everyone laugh at it. So they laughed at the swarm. And they laughed at the warnings, and they laughed at anyone who suggested that maybe they should be taking this more seriously. And while they were laughing, they were also building the Luna shipyards began construction in 2078. Hidden on the dark side of the moon where no Valith scanner would think to look, the first antimatter foundry on Titan became operational in 2095, producing enough destructive power every month to crack a small planet in half. The asteroid belt became something other than a collection of rocks in 2102, when humanity began seeding it with self-replicating minds that would wait patiently for over a century until something triggered them. And on Earth, in universities and military academies and secret facilities scattered across every continent, humanity trained the soldiers who would fight a war that most people did not believe was coming. These soldiers did not march in parades or appear on television. And if you asked them what they did for a living, they would tell you something boring about logistics or communications or administrative work. They called themselves the Mockingbirds. And they trained for a battle that would not happen for another 100 years, passing their knowledge down to the next generation and the next, building a tradition of quiet preparation that would outlast any individual human life. Crystalline Who Mourns returned to Earth in 2101 and found humanity having what they called a global economic crisis, which seemed to involve a great deal of shouting about. Numbers on screens. They are completely unprepared. The ambassador reported. I have scanned their entire planet and found no significant military development, no evacuation infrastructure, no indication that they are taking the threat seriously. The ambassador had scanned the planet. Very thoroughly, the ambassador had not thought to scan the moon, or the asteroid belt, or the moons of Saturn, or the 17 other locations where humanity was quietly building the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen. That was the thing about humans. They were very good at looking harmless in 2147. The swarm was 50 years away, and Crystalline Humorns made one final attempt to convince humanity to evacuate. I have seen the swarm devour worlds. The ambassador pleaded at a gathering of world leaders. Billions of souls silenced in hours, every trace of civilization reduced to nothing. Do you not comprehend what is coming? The human representative nodded sympathetically and said, "That sounds terrible, Ambassador, truly. And we feel for those civilizations that were lost. Then, evacuate," Crystalline Humorn said, the crystalline form flickering with frustration. "Let us save what can be saved. We appreciate the offer," the human said. "But we have decided to stay. You have decided to die. Maybe," the human agreed. But probably not. The ambassador left Earth that day convinced that humanity was insane. A species so committed to denial that they would joke their way into extinction rather than face the truth behind closed doors. The same human who had spoken so casually to the ambassador turned to the gathered leaders and said, "The Audacity launched yesterday. The Spite will be ready in 6 months. And the Pettiness and the Well actually are on schedule." Someone laughed at the ship names, because of course they did. Because these were humans, and they would name their warships ridiculous things and then use those ridiculous ships to kill anything that threatened them. "What about the minefield?" another leader asked. 97% deployed. The remaining 3% will be ready within the decade. And the orbital defense grid, 12,000 platforms. All operational, all disguised as civilian infrastructure. The leader who had spoken to the ambassador leaned back in their chair and smiled. "Then I think we are ready to stop joking." "We are never going to stop joking," someone else said. "That is the whole point," and they laughed because they were humans. And laughing was what they did, but underneath the laughter, there was something else, something harder and colder and more dangerous than any alien species had ever encountered. Humanity had spent 116 years pretending to be helpless while they built weapons that could crack planets and ships that could cross solar systems and soldiers who had trained their entire lives for a single battle. The swarm had no idea what was coming. Neither did the Valeth, but humanity knew. And humanity was ready. And humanity was still laughing because that was the best part of the whole thing. They were going to win. And they were going to do it while making fun of the enemy that thought they were harmless. The jokes were not denial. The jokes were the sharpest weapon humanity had ever created. The year was 2175, and the swarm was 23 years away. And humanity had somehow gotten worse. Crystalline Humorn stood before the Global Council, the successor to the old United Nations, and delivered what the ambassador expected to be the final warning before the Fuda Yin. "And the Devour Swarm has entered the outer reaches of your solar system's gravitational influence," the ambassador said, each word heavy with centuries of grief. "In less than a quarter of your century, they will reach your world, and there will be no escape." The human delegate, a woman named Sarah Chun, who had been chosen specifically because she could keep a straight face in any situation, nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for the update, Ambassador," she said. "We've been tracking their approach ourselves." This surprised Crystalline Humorns, because the Valeth had not believed humanity capable of detecting anything beyond their own planetary system. "You have been tracking them," the ambassador repeated. "How?" Sarah Chun said with a wave of her hand. "We have some satellites and things." The ambassador decided not to pursue this line of questioning, because there were more important matters at hand. "Ambassador," Crystalline Who Mourns said. Leaning forward, I have watched your species for over a century, and I have seen you respond to the news of your extinction with jokes and entertainment and what you call memes. And I need to understand why Sarah Chine's expression did not change. But something flickered behind her eyes. Why what? Ambassador, why are you not afraid? Crystalline Who Mourns asked. I have seen 11 civilizations receive this warning, and every single one of them responded with terror, with despair, with desperate attempts to flee or negotiate or surrender. But you humans, you just keep making jokes. Sarah Chun was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was different, softer, more honest than any Valith had ever heard from a human ambassador. Do you know what fear does to a species? It motivates them to survive. Sometimes, Sarah Chun agreed. But it also paralyzes them, divides them, turns them against each other. And we have seen that too in our own history. We have seen what happens when fear takes over. The ambassador listened, crystalline form flickering with something that might have been curiosity. When you came to us with your warning, Sarah Chung continued, we had a choice. We could have let the fear consume us. We could have spent the last 2 centuries fighting over who would get to evacuate, who would be saved, who would be left behind to die. That would have been rational. No, Sarah Chun said. That would have been extinction, just a slower kind. We would have torn ourselves apart long before the swarm arrived. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below, at the millions of humans going about their daily lives, as though they did not know that death was coming. So we made a different choice, she said. We decided to laugh, not because we are not afraid. Ambassador, we are terrified, every single one of us. But because laughter is how we stay together. It is how we remind ourselves that we are human, that we refuse to let fear define us. But you have made no preparations, Crystalline Who Mourns said. My scans show no military development, no defensive infrastructure. Nothing that could possibly... Ambassador, Sarah Chung interrupted. And now there was something in her voice that made the crystalline being pause. What do your scans show right now in this building? In this room, Crystalline Who Mourns activated the personal scanner that all Valith diplomats carried and looked at the results. I see you, the ambassador said. I see myself. I see the furniture and the walls and the structure of the building. And what do you see outside? The ambassador scanned the city. The continent, the planet. I see humans, Crystalline Who Mourns said. I see buildings and vehicles and infrastructure. I see a civilization that appears completely unprepared for what is coming. Sarah Chun smiled. And it was not the polite diplomatic smile that humans usually show to aliens. It was something else entirely, something that made the ambassador deeply uncomfortable. Yes, she said. That is what you see. She did not explain what that meant, and Crystalline Who Mourns did not ask. Because suddenly, the ambassador was not sure they wanted to know. The meeting ended shortly after, and the ambassador returned to the diplomatic vessel. And that night, something strange happened. Crystalline Who Mourns was reviewing the days. Recordings when a notification appeared from the ship's external sensors. Something had just launched from the far side of Earth's moon, the Vase moon. Ambassador's first instinct was to dismiss it as a glitch, because the Valith had been observing Earth's moon for centuries, and there was nothing there. No structures, no activity, nothing. But the sensors did not glitch. And they were showing something that should not exist. A ship, massive, angular, bristling with weapons that the ambassador did not recognize. Accelerating away from the moon at speeds that should have been impossible for any human technology before Crystalline Who Mourns could even begin to process this. Another notification appeared, and another 12 ships launched from the dark side of the moon in the space of an hour. Each one the size of a Valith cruiser, each one armed with weapons that made no sense to any scanner the ambassador possessed. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the ships vanished into the darkness of space. And the ambassador was left staring at sensor readings that contradicted everything the Valith believed about human capabilities. The next morning, the news feeds on Earth were showing videos of humans in costumes, celebrating something called Devourer Days, which appeared to be a festival dedicated to mocking the approaching swarm. There were parades with floats shaped like the swarm's bioships, and children wearing costumes designed to look like the creatures that had consumed 11 civilizations. And everyone was laughing and dancing and having what appeared to be a wonderful time. Crystalline Humorns watched this celebration and thought about the 12 ships that had launched in the night. The ambassador thought about Sarah. Chun Smile, the ambassador thought about 160 years of jokes and memes and humanity appearing completely unprepared for annihilation, and for the first time since taking this assignment, Crystalline Humorns began to wonder if the Valith had made a terrible mistake in their assessment of humanity, not because humans were doomed, but because humans might not be doomed at all. And if they were not doomed, if they had somehow been preparing this entire time while pretending to be helpless, then the Valith had underestimated them in a way that could have consequences far beyond this single battle. The ambassador sent a report to the High Council that night, flagged with the highest priority, containing only a single question: what if we were wrong about everything? The council did not respond, because they did not know what to say, because they had been watching humanity for nearly 2 centuries, and they had never once considered the possibility that the jokes might be hiding something somewhere in the depths of space. 12 ships that should not exist flew toward a battle that everyone thought was already decided. And on Earth, humanity kept laughing because that was what they did, and because, after all this time, they had earned the right to enjoy the setup before the punchline. The Devour Swarm arrived on March 15th, 2198, and humanity had spent the last 200 years waiting for exactly this moment. They had even named the day in advance, calling it Knife Day in internal military communications, because someone in the planning committee had made a joke about bringing a knife to a world-eating alien fight, and the joke had stuck. Because this was humanity, and jokes always stuck. Crystalline Humorns watched from the Valith observation sphere, 12 light-years from Earth, surrounded by the gathered representatives of the 17 species that made up the collective. None of them expected humanity to survive the day. The swarm entered the solar system like a wave of darkness. Billions of creatures moving in perfect coordination, bioships the size of cities, living weapons that had evolved over millions of years to consume everything in their path. The Valith had seen this 11 times before, and it always ended the same way. The target civilization would try to fight, they would fail. And within a single lunar cycle, everything they had ever built would be gone. Scan the human defense perimeter, the eldest council member said, and the observation sphere's sensors swept across the solar system. What they found made no sense. There is something in the asteroid belt, one of the observers reported. Voice confused. Millions of objects, too small to be ships, arranged in patterns that appeared deliberate. Before anyone could respond, the swarm reached the asteroid belt, and the millions of objects activated. The first wave of explosions was visible from 12 light-years away. Each mine had been designed to chain react with its neighbors, creating kill corridors that channeled the swarm into predetermined paths. And as the creatures tried to adapt, tried to find ways around the explosions, they found themselves being herded like animals toward slaughter. What is happening? Crystalline Humorns demanded, crystalline form flickering wildly. What are those weapons? No one answered, because no one knew. Because humanity had never shown anyone these weapons. had never even hinted that they existed. The swarm lost a quarter of its number in the asteroid belt. More casualties in a single hour than they had suffered in the last 1,000,000 years combined. But they were still coming, still advancing, still hungry, and then the ships appeared 12 vessels that the ambassador had seen launch from the moon, followed by dozens more, followed by hundreds. A fleet that should not exist emerging from hiding places across the solar system. The HFY Audacity led the charge. A dreadnought painted with what appeared to be a crude image of a human hand making an obscene gesture. And beside it flew the spite, the pettiness, actually, and 100 other ships with names that range from ridiculous to obscene to simply baffling. Is that ship really named the Are You Not Entertained? Someone asked. And no one had an answer. The human fleet engaged the swarm. And the battle that followed broke every model of warfare that Valeth had ever developed. Human ships did not fight like any other species the collective had encountered. They did not maintain formations, did not follow predictable patterns, did not seem to have any coherent strategy at all. The HFYF Spite executed a maneuver that the Valeth observers would later classify as mathematically impossible and strategically insane, diving directly into the Mycale center of the swarm formation, absorbing damage that should have destroyed it 10 times over, before detonating a weapon that created a hole in the enemy fleet, large enough to fly a moon through. That ship just sacrificed itself to destroy a command node. One observer said, voice shaking, no. Another observer corrected. Checking the sensors, the ship is still there. It is damaged but functional, and it is. They paused, not quite believing what they were seeing. It is firing again. The spite should have been dead. Its hull torn open in a dozen places, atmosphere venting into space. But the crew had simply sealed themselves into the sections that still worked and kept fighting. Because giving up was not something humans understood how to do. And while this was happening, while the battle raged across the solar system, humans on Earth were doing something that the Valeth found even more disturbing than the violence. They were making memes. Live combat footage was being edited in real time, overlaid with music and captions and what humans called reaction images, and then broadcast across every remaining network. Someone had set video of the swarm's first major defeat to an upbeat song from human history, and this video was being shared millions of times. Even as the battle continued, another human had created an image, comparing the swarm queen to a small Earth creature called a cockroach, with the caption, skill issue, and this had somehow become the most popular piece of content on the human internet. The Valeth observers did not understand what they were watching. The swarm, for the first time in their existence, did not understand what they were fighting. The creatures had evolved to consume civilizations that reacted to them with fear. Civilizations that made mistakes because they were panicking. Civilizations that broke and ran and died without coordinating. Humanity did none of these things. Every human soldier knew they might die, and they fought anyway. Not because they did not fear death, but because they refused to let that fear control them. Every human ship that was damaged kept fighting until it physically could not fire another shot. And sometimes even after that, ramming themselves into enemy vessels, if that was all they had left. And through it all, humanity kept laughing, kept joking, kept producing content that treated the existential threat to their species as though it were entertainment. The battle lasted 6 weeks. The swarm lost 70% of its number in the asteroid belt, and the inter-system engagement, they lost another 20% when humanity deployed what they called the Titan Surprise, the antimatter foundries that the Valeth had never detected, now converted into weapons of last resort, detonating with enough force to sterilize entire sections of space. The remaining 10% of the swarm fled. They had never fled before. In millions of years of consuming civilizations, they had never encountered anything that made them want to run, but they ran from humanity. They ran from a species that had spent 2 centuries pretending to be helpless, while building the most terrifying military force the galaxy had ever seen. They ran from a species that had made fun of them the entire time, the last recorded transmission from the swarm before they vanished into deep space was a single burst of what might have been communication, translated roughly as, "They are not afraid of us. They are not afraid of anything." What are they? Humanity's official response, broadcast on all frequencies, was a compilation video of their best memes set to triumphant music. The war was over, humanity had won, and they celebrated the only way they knew how, by making fun of everything, including themselves, including the enemy they had just defeated, including the observers who had spent 2 centuries watching them and never once understanding what they were seeing. On the observation sphere, Crystalline Who Mourns watched the celebrations and realized that the Valith had made a mistake that would take generations to fully understand. They had assumed that jokes meant weakness. They had assumed that laughter meant denial. They had been wrong. The jokes were not a sign that humanity did not understand the danger. The jokes were proof that humanity had understood the danger perfectly and had decided as a species that they would rather die laughing than live in fear. And now they were not dying at all. They were winning, and they were still laughing. The ambassador turned to the gathered council members and said the words that would change the Valith Collective's understanding of warfare forever. "I believe we have been looking at this completely wrong." The Valith High Council chamber had not been this silent in 3,000 years. Crystalline Who Mourns stood before the 17 species that made up the collective, each representative frozen in whatever passed for shock among their kind, and delivered a report that would change everything the galaxy believed about war, survival, and the strange species from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable star. "They won," the ambassador said. And even now, weeks after the battle had ended, the words felt impossible to speak. The Devour Swarm, which has consumed 11 civilizations, which has never been defeated, which we believe to be unstoppable, fled from human space. And they have not returned. The eldest council member, a being of living gas who had existed since before most species had developed language, spoke first. "Our projections indicated complete human extinction within 40 standard days of first contact. We calculated their technological capabilities, their military infrastructure, their population distribution, and every model showed the same result. The projections were wrong." Crystalline Who Mourns said. "We were all wrong." "How?" another council member demanded. "We watched them for 2 centuries. We scanned their planet, their solar system. We saw nothing that suggested they were capable of what you describe." The ambassador's crystalline form shifted through colors that indicated something between embarrassment and profound revelation. "They hid it." Crystalline Who Mourns said, "They built weapons capable of destroying the swarm. Ships that could match our own, infrastructure that would take most species millennia to develop. And they hid all of it behind jokes and memes and pretended incompetence. Why would any species do that? Because we were watching," the ambassador explained. "Because everyone was watching, and they did not want us to know what they were capable of. Or perhaps they simply did not care if we knew, because the weapons were not for us. They were for the swarm." The council struggled to process this, because it contradicted everything they understood about how civilizations functioned. Rational species displayed their strength to deter aggression. Rational species sought alliances and shared their capabilities with potential friends. Rational species did not spend 200 years being mocked by the entire galaxy, while secretly building enough military power to defeat an existential threat: humans. The Council was beginning to realize we're not a rational species. There is something else. Crystalline Who Mourns continued. Something I have only now begun to understand. And I believe it may be the most important thing I have learned in my centuries of service. The Council leaned forward, or performed whatever gesture indicated attention among their various physiologies. The jokes were not a sign of weakness. The ambassador said they were a weapon. Perhaps the most effective weapon humanity possessed. Explain. The Devourer Swarm evolved to consume civilizations that feared them. Crystalline Who Mourns said. Fear made their prey predictable. Fear caused mistakes. Fear turned species against themselves before the swarm even arrived. And for millions of years, this strategy was perfect. The ambassador paused. Crystalline form darkening with something that might have been respect. Humanity refused to be afraid. Crystalline Who Mourns continued. Not because they did not understand the danger, they understood it perfectly, but because they recognized that fear itself was a threat, perhaps a greater threat than the swarm. And so they chose to laugh instead. They chose, a council member repeated. They made a deliberate decision to respond with humor. Yes. And in doing so, they denied the swarm their primary weapon. When the creatures arrived expecting to face a terrified, divided civilization, they instead faced a species that had been making fun of them for 2 centuries. That had turned their very existence into entertainment. That treated the battle for survival as though it were a game they expected to win. The council was silent. Processing this information, the swarm did not know how to fight an enemy that was not afraid. Crystalline Who Mourns said they had never encountered such a thing. And it broke them, not the human weapons, not the human ships, though those were formidable, but the simple fact that humanity looked at death and laughed. The eldest council member spoke again, voice heavy with implications that extended far beyond this single battle. You are saying that humanity developed a form of psychological warfare that no species in the known galaxy has ever achieved. I am saying that humanity is different, the ambassador replied. Different in ways we did not recognize, could not recognize. Because we were looking for the wrong things. We were looking for fear and found jokes. And we assumed the jokes meant they were not taking the threat seriously. But the jokes were how they took it seriously. The jokes were how they stayed united, how they maintained morale, how they preserved their identity as a species while building the most dangerous military force any of us has ever seen. Another council member, a being of crystalline structure similar to the ambassador's own, asked the question that everyone was thinking. What does this mean for the collective? Crystalline Who Mourns had thought about this question for weeks. Ever since watching humanity celebrate their victory with a festival that included fireworks, alcohol, and a competitive event to determine who could create the most insulting meme about the defeated swarm. It means we need to reconsider everything we thought we knew about strength. The ambassador said, humanity is not powerful despite their jokes. They are powerful because of them. Because they have found a way to face the worst the universe can offer without losing themselves. The ambassador's form brightened with something that might have been hope. And it means that if humanity ever turns their strange, laughing, impossible strength outward, if they ever decide that the rest of the galaxy is a threat that needs to be dealt with, then nothing we have will stop them. The council fell silent again. This time, with a different quality to the silence, they were not confused anymore. They were worried. What should we do? Someone asked Crystalline Who Mourns. Considered the question carefully before answering. I suggest we be very, very nice to them. Far away, on a planet that was still celebrating a victory that most of the galaxy had believed impossible. Humanity was already moving on. The reconstruction had begun within days of the battle's end. Humans rebuilding what had been damaged with the same energy they had brought to everything else. And of course they were making jokes about it. Someone had produced a line of merchandise commemorating the war, including small stuffed versions of the Swarm, Queen that were described in advertising as adorable and perfect for children. A veteran of the battle, a woman who had commanded one of the ships that had engaged the Swarm directly, was already writing a comedy screenplay about the experience. Working title: The Swarm also rises and then falls, because we are built different. The human government had announced that they would be keeping their military capabilities at current levels, just in case, as the official statement put it, and the unofficial statement, leaked to the press almost immediately, added, and because it is really fun having ships named things like the Audacity of Hope, that you choke. The Valith diplomatic mission returned to Earth 3 months after the battle, and Crystalline Who Mourns requested a private meeting with Sarah Chun, who had been promoted to something called Secretary General of Everything Important. Ambassador, Sarah Chun said, smiling the same mysterious smile she had shown during their last meeting. What can I do for you? I have a question, Crystalline Who Mourns said. One that I have been wanting to ask since I watched your species defeat the greatest threat the galaxy has ever known. Ask, were you ever actually scared? Sarah Chun's smile faded, just for a moment, replaced by something older and heavier. Every single day, she said. For 200 years, Ambassador, we woke up knowing that something was coming to kill us all. Knowing that we might not be strong enough. Knowing that every joke we made might be the last one. Then why did you keep making jokes? Sarah Chun looked out the window at the city below, at the humans going about their lives, rebuilding and celebrating and arguing about things that did not matter. Same as they had always done. Because fear is a choice, she said. And we chose something else. What did you choose? Sarah Chun turned back to the ambassador, and her smile returned, brighter than before. We chose to be human, she said. Whatever that means, whatever it costs, we chose to face the universe on our own terms. And our terms include a lot of bad jokes. Crystalline Who Mourns did not fully understand this answer, suspected that no Valith ever would. But the ambassador nodded anyway. I believe the galaxy owes you an apology, Crystalline Who Mourns said. We underestimated you. That is okay, Sarah Chun replied. We were counting on it. The ambassador left, Earth that day with a new understanding of the species called humanity. They were strange, chaotic, seemingly irrational, and utterly unpredictable. They made jokes about everything, including their own death. They built weapons of unimaginable power while pretending to be helpless. And they had just saved themselves from extinction through a combination of military genius, technological innovation, and an absolute refusal to take anything seriously. The galaxy would be watching them differently now, watching with respect instead of pity.